Hello, hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It is wonderful to have 25 participants right now, and the number is growing. I just want to make sure you're in the right place. This is a webinar that is organized by the Global Responses to Education and the Environment Network, GREEN, which is a fantastic acronym, isn't it? And every other month, we ask experts, colleagues, bright minds, practitioners to present and share what they do. When we created Green, which is less than 18 months ago, the first demand we had from members was, please share. Let's share what we know. Let's share what we do. Let's share reflections. We need to learn from each other because education and climate is a little on the marginalized side of research. And so when we have research and analysis and assessments and blogs coming out, then we just want to share them and we want to hear about them. So that's why we hold these webinars every other month. I have to say, up to now, we have had the brightest minds on this planet present, and today is no exception. We're really moving the reflection on education and climate forward. So today is one of these fantastic opportunities to keep doing so. My name is Yolande Miller-Granvaux. I'm one of the leaders of GREEN. I'm based in Washington most of the time. Right now I'm in France, but I am with FHI 360. Kirsten Tibby is, you do not see her, but she is our tech guru right now. But she's also the CEO of Collective Mind, who has been building the network as a network with us as we go. So I am absolutely delighted to introduce our two. I told you they were brilliant speakers. You're gonna be amazed, and every sentence is gonna be a surprise and advance in knowledge. So Priya Joshi is part of the team that produces the global education monitoring report at UNESCO. She's been doing that for years. She knows the ins and outs of how UNESCO works, how the UN works, and even more so how the research has been advancing the field of climate and education. And Aaron Benavot, who's a professor at in Albany, New York, and he has been so active leading the reflection on measurement worldwide, measurement at national levels, measurement at local levels, measurement in every sense of the term for education and climate. And he's at the micro level and the macro level really trying to advance the visibility of measurement of the climate and education nexus. That is all I'm going to say as an introduction, because I'm so thrilled. Follow these two guys. Follow Aaron, follow Priya on their LinkedIn. They are incredibly active, and it's hard to keep up with them. So we're very happy that they're spending a little bit of time with us to present their work. That said, there will be presentations. There'll be a Q&A for our speakers. If you have questions regarding the network Green, please do not hesitate. Put them in the chat, and we will respond. We now have over 40 participants. Green has 80 organizations, and you coming from all over the world. So the dialogue is always very rich. Priya, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Yolande, for those very kind words, and thank you for this invitation to present this paper. I am now sharing my screen. I hope everyone can see it. Yes? Yeah.
Priya, we're
yes.
seeing your desktop here, not the PowerPoint.
Okay.
Try
not the
again.
PowerPoint. Okay. Let's see. Do you see the screen?
Yep. Now it's much better.
Perfect.
Great. So, as Ilan mentioned, Aaron and I have been in the business of thinking about this issue of education for people and planet. I worked under Aaron at the GEM Report in 2015-16 when we were at the beginning of the SDG agenda. And it's very nice to be presenting this work, which is again a co-production between GEM Report, UNESCO, and the MECCE project, which Aaron is the lead of the Global Indicator Development part of it. This is a report that was released in June 2024, and it provides sort of a broad framing of the links between education and climate change. I start always with this idea that we are framed in we sort of really use the Sustainable Development Goals framing. And when I was working on this topic in the beginning of the agenda, I think what's really striking about the conversations back then was the whole point of this was to integrate the environment and poverty agendas that came before, the 15 years preceding it, the Millennium Development Goals, the COP agendas. There was a lot of discussion around the aspiration to be interconnected. There's so many consultations, like over 2 years of conversation on like developing the SDGs. And I think what is also very powerful about the SDGs as a frame is the aspiration to be universal, that it was not just about poor countries, but also rich countries. And nowhere is this more important than I think in the climate change debate, because rich countries and richer people bear the burden of having caused the climate challenges we see today. Nearly 8 to 10 years later, I attend as the education in the SDGs lead for the team. I often am at these high-level political forum discussions or the UN type discussions on this topic, and these are some of my observations. I think the only official monitoring mechanism is the high-level political forum. All of these conversations are very siloed. The education community speaks to each other. There's the high-level reporting is very siloed, and the same for climate and other communities. What we find, of course, is compared to 2015-16, all of us have seen the world change. The multilateral environment is less favorable, and to some degree, I think what's striking to me, having been in this field for now 20 odd years, is there's a real regress to what we would consider older issues. And the older issues, of course, remain foundational issues, foundational literacy and numeracy, hunger and school meals. All of these have become very prevalent, very important in the conversation right now. And of course, climate and digital transition has moved up the agenda, and youth leadership has gained visibility and prominence. And I think will continue to gain prominence as we shape the new agendas to come. And despite all of this going on, I feel like the education community, maybe leading with us, has always asserted the importance of education for other outcomes. This is the idea that education, understood as formal, non-formal, informal learning, is a must to shape knowledge, behaviors, and attitudes, which are important for all other SDG outcomes, right? Whether you're talking about peace and security, whether you're talking about health and mortality, gender equality and empowerment, education is a must for all of this, as well as the professional capacities, right? So if you are a nutrition professional, if you are a security professional, when you are better trained, you act differently. So this is why education and education systems are very important. And as many of you in this room may know, one of the sort of key innovations of the SDGs was the idea of focusing on the right kinds and types of learning, which is really encapsulated in Target 4.7, Education for Sustainable Development and Global Citizenship Education, which Aaron, I'm sure, will elaborate further, if we are interested in more of this. I feel like the dilemma that we all face, we are in right now, is that we are in despite the evidence situation, which is that there's a lot of good evidence that education is really important. And at the same time, there's a lack of evidence situation that certain types of evidence are not being developed. The type of evidence that might speak better to other groups are not being developed. So then the question is, what do we do about it? And this first paper that we are presenting today is the first paper in an education in the SDG series. It focuses on climate change. As I mentioned, the motivation is really that education, of course, is important. We all have gone through schooling of some sort, so everyone recognizes it. But I think it's largely underemphasized in broader climate conversations. The objective was to bring the education and climate community conversations closer together, however we could, including in participating in networks like this. And the partnership is this is a result of a partnership that continues between the GEM report and the MECCE project, which also included an extensive piece of work on the climate change communication and education profiles, which profiles the climate change communication and education situation in 80 countries, which is like almost 75% of the world. The way we frame the interlinkage is shown in this figure. I think if you look at the sort of bottom half of this figure, climate change negatively affects education. I feel like I've been in so many conversations in recent weeks on this topic. Just yesterday, I was part of a panel on the alarming impacts of climate change on Pakistan, where there was a lot of discussion on, the contextualization needs, how solutions have to be shaped based on, the topographies of the country. I think we all understand, the lives lost, the income loss, the displacement challenges, there's so many different impacts, the effects of climate change that then disrupt education, which means that this multifaceted problem requires multifaceted responses for the education system. This paper takes, I would say, an over prioritization, like prioritizes more the idea that education has like a critical role in addressing climate change. And the broader argument here is that even though this role is critical, it is not sufficiently mobilized. And many of us know this, and I think we all sort of agreed with this assertion. Education increases knowledge and awareness. There's a lot of there's variability, of course, around the world on what is being learned in science classrooms and other classrooms. But we know that there is, there is a lot of information out there on environment and climate change. We also know from the evidence on education as years of schooling that if there was more education, there would be important impacts on climate adaptation and mitigation. Universal secondary education could reduce disaster deaths. Universal secondary education can empower girls to make childbearing decisions. Improved education can make sure that, educated farmers, like if there was far more educated farmers, they would be more able to diversify crops, alter crop calendars, and just have the sort of know-how to be more climate resilient in their practices. This is just what the evidence tells us. And of course, none of us would argue against this. Education is key for developing skills. This is about job creation for new green jobs and transitioning of existing jobs to become more green. And this is about the whole range of jobs, from wind power, solar, to forestry, to construction, to government capacity, right? So, and a lot of what we hear in the sort of higher education and TVET discussion is skill shortages are holding back climate projects. Universities need to do better on focusing on learning and teaching, and curricula just need to be adapted better to deal with the climate challenges and the climate reality they're facing. And I mentioned this as earlier. The conundrum really is that even though we all recognize educating people is important, right? That if we educate those currently at school, it'll help shape and sustain future policy making. And actually, cities around the world really have done many types of educational projects. We know that more education means more consumption, often because you have the tools to consume more, because your income is improved. There's more carbon emissions per capita. And the other thing that we have seen in data around communication is that data from perspectives from people is that just because you're more educated, you are maybe more able to say that, oh, yes, I'm concerned and aware of the environment, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're taking actions on, or political or other actions. And I think we sort of try to make the argument here that it's because knowledge is only one aspect of behavioral change. One sort of point that I think has been highlighted by others, but especially by this Yale climate change communication analysis, that the consequences of climate change may feel far away and difficult to prioritize in daily decisions. And this simply, I would say that, I might say that I might be more likely to say that it will cause a great deal of harm to future generations, but my niece and nephew are much more likely to say that yes, in my lifetime, I'm likely to face climate change challenges. And I think there's also a vulnerability. This is also linked to vulnerability. People in richer countries are less likely to feel like it's going to affect them, whereas people in poorer countries are like, it's happening to us now. So this is what the data from this Yale Climate Change Communication Survey shows us. So overall, really, I think a powerful point made in the paper is that the focus on just knowledge, on just scientific knowledge, or content knowledge is not enough. There's a lot going on. There's a complexity around this. Values, ideologies, worldviews, political orientation are actually important in predicting climate change belief. It's not just about the educational knowledge you receive. And what that means then is that the climate change education we are providing needs to be transformative. Right? It needs to embrace uncertainty. It needs to provide and have a comprehensive approach. There needs to be critical inquiry around it. And I think one of the other things we've stressed is that there needs to be experiential and inquiry-based learning, which I think a lot of the members here also champion. Something I had alluded to before, the climate action agenda in education has moved up the agenda. We find that from the MECCE and GEM report profiles, climate change education is part of government policy in many countries. The majority of countries have some laws and policies or plans around curricula, and majority have some communication and awareness programs. But I highlight again, education's role in climate action broadly remains underappreciated. Fact one, education systems are underfinanced generally. Millions are not accessing quality education, however we understand it. Fact two, education is consistently neglected as a solution in climate action plans and financing. And I guess the reflection from this paper and the research around it is education systems may not have transformed adequately to focus on climate action. This is something that comes from the evidence and from voices. And what I would say is that there is definitely this hunger for a broad vision of climate change. What we find is that the evidence base is not substantially broad or large scale. But of course, we see that if there is a certain kind of training that improves teaching practices, they are able to incorporate and do better on learning. We know that there are lots of large-scale school networks that have action-oriented approaches. The UNESCO Associated School Projects, the Eco Schools program, the Take Action Global Climate Action Schools, these come to mind, where there's sort of a there's sort of a real emphasis on this learning by doing and experiential learning approach. We mentioned the policy shifts in school systems, and some of them are more radical more sort of transformative than others. But always, I guess, with any topic, teachers are very challenged also in delivering on the climate change education. There's a lack of time, there's a lack of financing, there's a lack of resources, there's a lack of support to really make this happen in any meaningful manner in many, many countries around the world. And one other point to really highlight is that the student and youth are really leading these demands, which I think a lot of it's so obvious for all of us to see. Youth find formal education lacking. They have a preference for more action-oriented learning, more contextualization, more climate change and justice, thinking behind their education. They learn informally when they go on climate strikes, when they sort of engage with their teachers. They're learning how to deal with regulations, developing demands, etc. They're demanding changes in their formal textbooks, in their curricula, and they're often demanding justice, right? So they're the most vocal in demanding in litigation of climate change, related to climate change, or in fossil fuel divestment. So you do find that this is a universal story. There's no global north, global south here. There's, which of course there'll be regional variation and contextual variations, but there's definitely this leadership by student and youth. I sort of ran through the paper, but I would say that we end by saying that to help achieve education's potential for climate action, we say that it's very important to shift the paradigm so that education can rise up to the demands. So this is really about the climate action, the orientation, like how learning is happening, but it's also about the creation of the evidence, how we are researching what is happening as well. And are we producing the evidence that convinces us and others that education, like the type of education, is actually making meaningful change in people's lives. The second point is about recognizing education for its role in developing solutions. And this is really about higher education systems, and TVET. Are we really, evolving in the right ways? The third point is the multisectorality point, right? We are often in climate finance conversations. We're often like around climate finance discussions, and when trillions of dollars are being discussed, we don't find that education investment is adequately adequately embedded in these conversations. And the final point is, of course, we're a monitoring report. If we're doing all of this, if systems are changing to green, green education systems, are we monitoring it? We need to commit to monitoring. So that is the presentation writ large. I think the one thing I did want to emphasize is my pitch has always been that it's all fine for education sector to be more very important, actually, not just all fine, that for education sector to be talking to each other and improving how they talk to each other. But what we also need to do is widen who we're talking to and widen who is listening to these arguments. And so we're very pleased that this paper had endorsements from UNDESA, from the Columbia Climate School, from Systems Change Lab and Mathematica and AFS and WWF. So people who are not always just in the business of education. And I think that just adds more to the advocacy and thinking around making this work go beyond our sector. And this is being done with, of course, diverse strategic engagements that continue, including today. And we also have a call to action for youth that we will be, building for the Summit of the Future and then COP. And we of course hope that we take it beyond that. So the idea, of course, is that the youth are leaders and they need to urge governments to prioritize action on these topics. So that is the presentation of the whole topic. What I wanted to do now was to give the floor to Aaron by sort of focusing on this fourth bullet of the recommendations, the commit to monitoring efforts to greening education, starting with the curriculum. And this is sort of linked to our sort of key initiative on SDG 4, indicator development and benchmarking, and linked to the Transforming Education Summit, which is a global summit that happened in 2022. Beyond sort of the indicators that were already higher up on the agenda for monitoring, like you can imagine completion and learning and gender gaps or gender parity. There was a sort of a demand to develop 3 different indicators: greening education, digital transformation, and youth participation. And there has been a substantial amount of work that's gone into the indicator on greening education, which is linked to the MECCE project. And I will give the floor to Aaron now to bring this up. Aaron, over to you.
Okay. Thanks so much, Priya. Let me begin by again thanking the leadership team and the Green Network for the invitation to present here. I also want to acknowledge the enormous contributions of my colleagues in the MECCE project, in particular, the principal investigator, Professor Marcia McKenzie, and then a whole series of other colleagues, Kristen Hargis, Aaron Redman, Sri Lakshmi Subaswamy, Sujong An, and Diego Posada, who've been working literally over the last 3 or 4 years to get to a point where we're able to make a presentation such as the one that we are giving here, and also to integrate our work in the policy paper that Priya has been presenting. I'd like to begin by problematizing just a bit this notion of greening education or greening curriculum. I think it would be fair to say that this is a fairly recent construction, a concept that didn't exist during the decade for education for sustainable development. It was not mentioned in the SDGs. The first occasion, at least as best I can tell, at the international level was in the pre-summit in Paris, the summit in anticipation of the Transforming Education Summit in New York in September. And the term here clearly has an organizational anchor, which is the creation of UNESCO's Greening Education Partnership that refers to 4 different pillars: greening schools, greening teacher training and education system capacities, greening communities, and greening curriculum. A couple of weeks ago, they put out 2 new reports that provide guidance around greening schools and greening curriculum, which you have, if you haven't seen, certainly worth looking at. The point that I wish to make about this idea of greening education, greening curriculum, is that there is no, let's say, consensus definition of what this means. I've taken here some quotations both from some of the reports and from the websites. There is this emphasis, I guess, on maybe 3 different aspects. One is changes in the inputs. So in terms of school infrastructure, curricula, teacher training, all of that is part of, let's say, a series of inputs that undergo some kind of greater awareness around climate issues and so on and so forth, or change some of the ways in which the schools are organized. Then there's an emphasis on, as you see here in black, the kinds of skills, knowledge, attitudes, and values and sense of agency among learners, both young learners and even adult learners. But also the third part would be the kind of like the overall impact that these changes might have in terms of promoting sustainable development or climate mitigation, adaptation, and so on. Priya, the next slide, please. Great. It is, I think, worthwhile, and I just say this kind of very much in passing, that there are 3 different concepts that in some ways are being used here. One is education for sustainable development that has a long history, as does the notion of environmental education, goes back decades, ESD more recent. There was an attempt at UNESCO to focus on climate change education, although primarily in the fields of science and geography. And so, as noted here, and it's interesting to look at this definition, given the growing recognition of the complexity of the climate crisis and its impact across all aspects of society, young people are calling for a more holistic approach to education related to climate change, one that helps people understand and address the impacts and so on and so forth. So the idea of greening education is to address the youth demand and their right to know and be prepared. And so greening education has been introduced as a communication term to describe this revised approach to education's response to the climate crisis. So it isn't, let's say, a conceptual construction, but it's more an attempt to provide a concept that allows for communicating a whole series of different ideas, a much more comprehensive and holistic vision of the kind of education that needs to be embedded in national education systems around the world. Next slide, please. In the context of this current work that we've been doing, here we have operationalized this notion of greening education in a very concrete way. And that is, for the purposes of monitoring greening education, we have sought to assess the extent to which countries are prioritizing and including content related to environment, sustainability, and climate change in 2 types of official documents. First of all, what we call national curricular frameworks. So these are official overviews of curricular policies on the one hand, and subject curricula or syllabi in the sciences and the social sciences at multiple grade levels. In this case, we've been looking at grades 3, 6, and 9. Clearly, one could also one could expand this operational definition to include the greening of other areas, but we'll leave that to the future. Next slide, please. I just want to say a word about the MECCE project, which has been involved in the development of this work. And it's important to keep in mind that the MECCE project draws much more its legitimacy for monitoring climate communication and education, less from the SDGs and more from the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change that has within it both in 1992 in the original convention and then in the Paris Agreement in 2015, particular paragraphs that speak about climate communication and education. And these are often referred to as the Action for Climate Empowerment, the ACE initiative. Next slide, please. The ACE initiative has 6 elements that you can see here: education, training, public awareness, public participation, public access to information, international cooperation. So the MECCE project in many ways has been developing indicators around each of these 6 ACE elements. We've taken education and separated into primary, secondary education on the one hand and higher education on the other. Next slide, please. And so these are some of the outputs that the MECCE project, which has been around now for about 4 years, moving into our 5th year. This is a Canadian-funded partnership grant. So you can see there are 3 major kinds of outputs. One are the global indicators that I've been leading on, and then our partnership with the GEM Report that we developed the 80 country profiles that are also organized around the ACE elements, and then a series of 30 case studies that the MECCE project has funded very modestly to try to look at innovative work in this area of climate change and communication. Next slide, please. In developing the indicators that I'm focusing on here, my colleagues and I reviewed a large number of existing data sources, more than 150, and tried to determine, based on a series of criteria, which I'm kind of skipping over here, is the data publicly accessible? Does it have more than one time point? And does it cover enough countries in the world? In the end, we prioritized a little over 40 data sets, and based on these data sets, we have constructed 14 global indicators of climate communication education. Next slide, please. So here you see the list of the 14 indicators, and I've focused on the 2 that are currently already online. You can see them on the MECCE website that deal with primary, secondary education. One is the integration of let's say the greening of national curricular policies on the one hand, and the integration of environment, sustainability, and climate change in the grade 9 science and social science curriculum. But you can also see some of the other indicators that we put up. There are really 2 different kinds of indicators here: those that are based on kind of the repurposing of existing data, and those that we have created, such as the ones around the curriculum. Next slide, please. So in the course of the last 4 years, the MECCE project has received funding from UNESCO to basically analyze the greening of national curricular frameworks on the one hand, and then eventually school curricula on the other. And we have collected more than 1,500 official documents in 40 different languages. The National Curricular Framework documents cover about 160 countries. All of that information you can see on the MECCE website. And we now have probably much more than the 1,400 subject syllabi that cover 3 different grade levels for about 90 countries, including 5 federal countries where we collected the information at the subnational level. So in Canada, the different provinces, in Argentina, the different provinces, and so on and so forth. And what we did is that we created, together with our UNESCO colleagues, a consensus list of 35 green keywords in 3 different clusters. And then these keywords had to be translated in more than 30 languages and then validated by language experts. And what we attempted to determine was how prevalent are these green keywords in the official documents, and then standardize the number of times that a keyword is present by the length of the document, by the total number of words in the document. So if I refer to standardized green references, that's after it's been standardized by the length of the document. Next slide, please. So we have focused on basically 2 major knowledge domains: the science knowledge domain, but we have not collected information on mathematics syllabi. And in the social sciences, this is a very broad range of social science subjects, including religion, indigenous studies, ICT, but it does not include any syllabi related to languages or literature. We collected up to 4 subject syllabi at each grade level. So for grade 3 in a particular country, you could have up to 8 syllabi that we collected. Typically, you would see this in grade 9 and not in grade 3. And then there was a special category of subjects that are more interdisciplinary, that the subject name was Education for Sustainable Development or Environmental Education, that these are subjects that often integrate both science and social science content. Next slide, please. Here are the keywords that you can see that we used. I might just mention in passing, I have ESD, EEC, and ESS. The ESD you obviously know, but the EEC is a Chinese term for Education for Ecological Civilization, which we had not known about until we got started on this project. And in Japan, they often use the term Education for Sustainable Societies, and both of these terms are meant to convey a much broader view of the impact of education on sustainability that goes beyond just, let's say, development issues, however defined in the typical literature. Next slide, please. So what are some of the basic findings? We have identified something like 19,000 green keywords in the more than 1,500 documents that we looked at. About 2/3 of these basically relate to the environment cluster. About 1/4 of them are to the sustainability cluster, and only 10% to the cluster dealing with climate change. And this is a bit of a tricky point because it's not entirely clear. We don't have clear-cut evidence of if a country mentions either sustainability or environment, are they necessarily teaching content related to climate change or the climate crisis? That's something that needs to be determined in the future. We start from the assumption that probably yes, and increasingly so, but this is not something that we have clear-cut evidence. We have found that green keywords are much more prevalent in the upper grades of grades 6 and 9, less so in grade 3. They're much more likely to be introduced in the science domain in the early grades, and then social sciences become more prevalent with green keywords in the upper grades. And about 15 to 20% of countries include content in these integrated or interdisciplinary subjects, such as environmental studies, ESD, and environmental education. Next slide, please. Additional findings is that we see an increase in one of the things that we can do with the documents, that some of them go back like 10 or 15 or 20 years. So when we organize the documents by the date of publication, we see that the standardized green references have increased in the documents that have been published after 2014. They tend to be high-income countries tend to have more of these standardized references than lower-income countries. This is especially the case in the science area, less so in the social sciences. And what's also interesting is that countries in particular regions, especially in Oceania and some of the small island developing states, they have a much higher level of green, standardized green keywords than in other parts of the world. Next slide. This is just the evidence on the change over time. You can see the green being the higher number of green keywords than the one below, indicating just how much there's been an expansion or an increase in keywords related to the 3 clusters in the documents that have been published after 2014. Next slide. I'm going to move quickly here because I want to make sure we have time for questions, but this is the evidence about the different regions. Let's move to the next slide, please. So let me just now speak about this greening education indicator. As Priya has already mentioned, the greening education indicator, the motivation for this comes from the Transforming Education Summit, subsequent to which the high-level steering committee met in Paris and came to the decision that there should be an indicator on greening education that was meant to be developed by the GEM report together with UIS. And we, at this point, had the ability to put together a proposal. Next slide, please. Here you can see a report that we prepared for the GEM report. I'm happy to share this, although it has yet to be published, that we basically produced a series of different approaches to how we might construct a greening education indicator, some of the considerations that could be considered in producing this kind of an indicator. Next slide, please. In the end, we basically started from this assumption that we want to build an indicator that reflects a more comprehensive and holistic approach to the greening of the curriculum, which is another way of saying that we wanted to use information from all 4 data sources, the national curricular frameworks and the 3 grade levels, for both knowledge domains, both science and social sciences. So countries that are including green content across all these different areas would have a higher value than countries that are, let's say, making a lot of effort in one particular knowledge domain at one grade level. These would be counted less so. And we developed an algorithm that you can see the results of this kind of in the table. You can see that at each grade level, the science, the greening of science is higher than the greening of the social sciences. Again, you can see that when you look at specific terms like climate change or biodiversity, it's much lower than the overall kind of set of green keywords that we looked at. We've tried to develop this on a scale from 0 to 100, and you can see that most countries the average is below 50. Next slide, please. Here's a little bit what the greening education indicator looks like for the 76 countries for which we have comprehensive information. In other words, all data streams. We've now increased this number, but have yet to run the analysis. I think by the end of the summer, we should have close to 100 countries. You can see something like a normal distribution, that there are some outliers that are very high. Partly these are very small countries in Oceania, and quite a few countries that have almost no greening, but most of the countries are in the middle, in the lower, let's say, in the second quintile. Next slide, please. Here's a mapping of the greening education indicator that we provide. You can see which countries that we have information for, and those that are darkened are countries that have a higher GEI than countries that the coloring is much lighter. Next slide, please. So what are the next steps? Basically, we've put forward, it's a long convoluted process. So now we've kind of gone back to the SDG framework, and we've basically said, we think that we can put together a valid indicator of the greening of the curriculum. In particular, it's relevant to target 13.3. In the initial global indicator that was provided for 13.3, it was precisely about the inclusion of climate mitigation adaptation in the curricula of primary, secondary, and higher education. So we've developed a kind of the metadata, and hopefully we'll put forward this proposal in New York. It's being now reviewed by countries that are part of the high level, whatever it's called, the SDG high level committee. We are trying to increase, as I mentioned, the number of countries that have information that we're trying to complete, let's say, the set of data points that we need in order to increase the number of countries. So we're closer to half or 60% of the countries in the world. We are also asking countries to reflect and give comments about the kind of approach that we put forward here, that perhaps it can be tweaked or refined or reorganized in ways that can capture some of the concerns. And maybe the last thing that I would just mention, it's a little bit beyond the scope of this particular presentation, but this collection of curricular documents is now quite unique. It's a repository of, let's say, close to 2,000 documents now. In many ways, we think that they can also be analyzed for other content, let's say related to global citizenship or gender equality, and so on. And so eventually we would hope that perhaps a couple of years down the line, we might even have a proposal for, let's say, an indicator that would measure target 4.7 in a more comprehensive way than that is currently the case. So I think I'll leave it there. I think that's the last slide that I had. Priya, is there one more there? No, I think it's the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you from both of us. I feel like please do read the paper, which includes I would say the breadth of the content that I was discussing, and a synthesized version of the monitoring discussion that Aaron was presenting on. And yeah, we're just now really looking forward to the Q&A. I think the main
there we go. Yeah.
I think the main thing I would say is that for me, what's been interesting is the development in terms of people really trying to find coherence around research on this topic, and also quite a few people trying to figure out programming and like in any other sector, I guess there's a lot of discussion of is there complementarity, is there competition, is there and how do we sort of cohere together in ways that actually benefit societies and communities. So I think it's just interesting to be here, and would be good to hear reflections from the network of people who are really seeped in this in practice and also research terms. Over to you, Yolande.
Thank you so much, Priya and Aaron. I told you earlier it was going to be rich, and it really was. The amount of data points that you presented is not only amazing, but it's very helpful when we want to develop programs, interventions at every level. So thank you so much. I see three clusters of questions for you. The first one is about gender. Dechen asked about the gendered aspect of greening education, and I was wondering if one of you could talk to it. The second question, I'm going to give you the three clusters, that way you can decide which one to take. There's a set of questions about the curriculum, of course. Lauren asked a question whether you see other plans for putting indicators in place to monitor the funding of curriculum development and curriculum implementation. And Lauren, you can refine that question if you'd like. Another question by Josh is, how do you see the curriculum versus teaching practices? So we have these thousands of documents from the curriculum, and we know that teaching practices do not always align with the curriculum. So what do you know about this? What do you see? And then finally, around the curriculum, there's always a question, knowing that greening education is not going to be tested, assessed, what's the motivation of teachers and students? So that was the second set of questions, and I'll give you the third one, which is infrastructure and transportation. Did you see anything related to creating positive infrastructure? How does infrastructure for school buildings become climate positive infrastructure? Did you see anything in your data that could speak to it? All right, so the first one is gender.
I think maybe the first and third question, Priya can take a whack at, or we can both, and I'm happy to answer the second questions around the curriculum. Is that okay, Priya?
You're on mute.
You're still muted, Priya.
Yeah, please go ahead, Aaron.
So I'll speak to the curriculum issues first. So the way we conceive of let's say, a curricular system is that it begins with these very high-level documents. They could be laws, they can be regulations, they can be these policy documents. Typically, they're written for both internal and external audiences. And therefore, they might have a certain flavor of trying to incorporate fashionable elements like things related to climate. But as you move closer to the actual subject matter, you move away from, let's say, a high-level document to a document that's clearly being written by curriculum specialists, subject specialists, and experts who've been working in this area typically for many years, and they have they're writing documents that are meant to be taken up by teachers in terms of organizing classroom interactions and content and instruction, and to some extent also what would be assessed. The fact that there's in many countries, let's call it a decoupling or a lack of alignment between the official intended curriculum and what teachers do in the classroom. We know this to be the case in many systems around the world. And teachers often make use of additional elements beyond those or add things. And then finally, one could look at textbooks, which is a whole kind of different avenue of trying to determine the kinds of content that teachers are bringing into the classroom. Now, in the report that we published with UNESCO on grade 9, we actually did survey teachers in a very limited number of countries. So I guess there's 2 points that I want to make. One is that if you were to think about the association between the policy documents and the subject curricula, we assume that they should be, let's say, aligned. So if there's no green content in the policy, you wouldn't expect to see it in the curriculum, and vice versa. If there's a lot of content in the policy, you expect to find. And so what we're interested in are those that are off the diagonal, that are the typical one that we think is that the policy documents push green content, but the curricula do not. But there's also the case in which curricula are pushing green content, even though the policy document may not include it. And some evidence of this we found in the responses of teachers of grade 9, that many of them indicated that they went beyond what was required of them in the official curriculum in some of the subjects that they taught to include more climate-related content. So I think that we should not assume in this particular area that necessarily teachers are completely, let's say, misaligned or unaligned with official policy, and that there's, a lot of interesting kind of processes that are going on here related, first of all, to the experts and what they begin to integrate into the official curriculum and potentially into the textbooks, and what teachers decide to bring into the classroom, either in terms of examples and so on and so forth. So it doesn't necessarily kind of capture the way a lot of educational researchers tend to think about this alignment issue, let's say, in other topic areas. The last point that I would make is that with respect to assessment, clearly in those countries in which the greatest emphasis is placed on something like a high stakes assessment at the end of primary, the end of lower secondary, maybe even at the end of upper secondary, to the extent that this green content is not incorporated in the assessment, and we have no evidence of being able to determine this one way or the other. But I think the main assumption put forward by the colleague would be, to the extent that assessments do incorporate more green content, then you would expect teachers and both the teachers, the textbooks, and also the official syllabi to more reflect that green content. So I think there's, and as Priya mentioned, we see a very interesting process going on, especially in the secondary level, where a lot of young people are demanding of their schools more exposure to things related to climate than is necessarily the case in the official intended curriculum. So this is another element of the forces at work to show, as it were, what seems like misalignment, but it's misalignment in the sense that there's weak green content in the official documents, but there's actually a lot more that's now emerging in the classrooms, given the kind of activists and voices of young people in their schools, not in all schools, but certainly in some schools in this area. Over to you, Priya.
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you for these questions. I would like to take these in a holistic way by answering, if you go back to the framing that I presented of education, of the bidirectional linkages. Of course, it's a much more complicated interlinkages system, but we presented to the idea that education can affect climate change adaptation and mitigation, and we presented that climate change as a challenge is devastating education systems. And the second part, right, the climate change is devastating education systems, and we need to adapt, has, I think, gotten a lot more attention in recent years because, of course, it's an immediate experience, right? So I think people were asking about infrastructure, about transportation. There's a lot of movement from all of the big sort of finance, big financial institutions to make a dent in the infrastructure discussion. And resilience of infrastructure is a big, conversation. I think at the same time, there's a discussion to try to make it a multifaceted conversation. So it should not just be about infrastructure. It should be about, teachers, and it should be about, the overall holistic framing around this. But I would say, as always has happened in development finance, infrastructure will get the big piece of the pie. Infrastructure changing will be a big part of the story, already is, and going forward as well. And I think the World Bank has recently released a report on climate. So that has a lot of this discussion. And I think a lot of the alarm is around climate risk. Because of climate shocks, schools have been closed. And I think we're now getting more and more information on the intensity of this school closure and how much is disrupting schooling on an annual basis. And also yesterday, when I was hearing this Pakistan discussion, the schools are used as sites, as camps, right? So that is adding quite a layer of challenge for the education and learning system. So I would say that the infrastructure, transportation, all of that discussion is really rising up, and I think it'll continue with the green, like the adaptation finance discussions at COP and other places. And in the same way, right, this victimizing discussion or narrative, gender is discussed in the same way. I would say, that there's a disproportionate impact on marginalized groups, on women and girls who don't have access to resources. But it's the same sort of narrative, let's say, that I think you see quite a bit. And as a result of that, I think there's a discussion that we need gender justice, we need climate justice, we need, we need that. It's not sort of incorporated in the greening education indicator per se, but what I would say is there was a small picture in the early part of my slide that was sort of representative of what we developed in 2016 on a whole school model. And one of the ideas there is basically that, if you're teaching something, you can teach that with the whole school. So you're teaching, education for sustainable development, you're teaching gender equality, you're engaging with the community, you're, taking action in your localized context. And to a large degree, I think what we are all aspiring for, even the greening education indicator, right, and this discussion of curriculum, teaching practice, indicator development. I think what I find the reason it's very important is that it signals the need to focus on content and not just getting people into school. For like, we are really always, like, when COVID happened, there was a lot of this emphasis on, oh my God, all these years of learning lost. Anytime a shock happens, it really just like shifts the conversation back to, what I call, bread and butter issues or basic issues. So I think that is really the real significance of the greening education as an indicator conversation, that it might be complicated, it might be very evolving. There's a lot there to unpack, and a lot of sophisticated work is happening clearly. But I think it's really that we cannot, we have to make progress. No, we can't just keep running back to, do we have the infrastructure, which of course is super important. But that's how I would answer these questions for now. And I think the assessment discussion is also important. Just a one point to make that, PISA and TIMSS, which sort of drive the global narrative for richer and middle income countries, their next rounds are trying to be more sophisticated in how they ask these questions, what they're asking. So I do feel like 2024-25, when all of that data comes in, there'll be yet another round of discussion on what our children, what are sort of eighth graders, what are they really learning? And that can also pivot the agenda even more to climate action. And we're already seeing it in the instruments they've developed, but we can't underestimate the importance those big international assessments have. Yeah.
You're muted, Yolande.
Thank you. We have 2 minutes and 2 questions. One is Nolan, and Nolan, I'm not sure if you're still there, and I'm not sure I understand your questions, but the terms youth and young people appear a lot. And Nolan was wondering what your thoughts are on leaving no one behind if you single out certain demographics. I'm not sure, Nolan, exactly what you're referring to, but if you have thoughts, Priya or Aaron. And the final one is, you talked about, Priya, in your presentation, gaps in higher education. Higher education institutions have focused more on, certain issues and not others. If you could talk more about this, and you basically have 30 seconds to answer each question.
Yeah. So I'll take the first question. I think that at least in terms of the MECCE project and the work that I've been leading, we've been trying to develop indicators that both look at changes in knowledge, awareness, and attitudes, not only among young people, but also among adults. Very much a lifelong learning perspective, and I think that's critical. The problem is that the kind of data that you would want to have about the ways in which older adults, older people, I mean, anyone over, let's say, 25, the kinds of learning opportunities that they have available, which tend to be non-formal or informal. There's almost no international data, or often these are not organized by the state, but all kinds of civil society actors, that there's no kind of systematic collection of information. So what we are collecting are things that are more easily accessible and available, but in terms of the importance of affecting change or addressing the crisis, I personally, and I think many people would agree, that you would want to mobilize every individual, every citizen, young and old, and engage in conversations that are both intergenerational and more age specific. So that's, I think, a little bit the bias that is kind of melded into the work that we've covered here.
Terrific. Thank you, Aaron. We over time, but Priya.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think higher education institutions are can be quite pivotal, and in many, especially the United States, have been pivotal in the shaping of the country. And the idea is simply that higher education institutions can be examples in terms of their infrastructure and how they govern themselves, but also in how they teach and learn, how they engage with the communities, how they engage with the K-12 system, research and other academia, other countries, right, if they are better resourced. So I feel like there are key examples of higher education institutions that have really championed climate education in that way, in that holistic way, and there can be more of that work. On youth, all I want to say is it is, I think, a temptation to give them more visibility because, of course, they're energized. But I think what we're also trying to think about, the GEM report, I'm also working on the youth participation indicator. The idea is about meaningful youth engagement in political leadership. And are we really able to shift the dialogue there? It's not about leaving other people behind. It's just that consistently what we see is that young people are made visible, but they're not heard. So it's a question of intergenerational harmony on this issue of how we live together on this planet, and really capitalizing on their energy and making sure that their voices are heard in political conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you gave the conclusion to a beautiful conclusion to this webinar. We have to log off. Thank you, Priya. Thank you, Aaron. There's so much to talk about. Sorry, Patrick, we could not take your question. Stay tuned, and please go on the MECCE's website and look at all the amazing resources that are available. Follow us on Green, and be well, and let's make this planet a little cleaner through education. Thank you, Priya. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you all. Take care. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.